Welcome back, listener. I am here with Stephanie, and we are covering a different topic. This is going back to attending the conference at the end of May, the Mountain Words Festival. Stephanie attended a workshop there that she wanted to bring to this podcast as far as a discussion on another source that may be sort of untapped into for inspiration in your writing. Kick it off to you, Stephanie. Tell us what it's about and what is this source of inspiration that we probably have just like laying around and that we're doing throughout our day, anyways.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Elizabeth. Well, I'm going to be talking today about using lists as a tool for writing. I attended a workshop that was led by a Colorado author who's written two essay series, collection of essays, and lives in Colorado, whose name is Leath Tonino. So this is inspired from his talk. And it's so interesting because, as you said, Elizabeth, it's something that we probably do every day in our daily life. You have a grocery list, you have a to-do list, you have uh, a list of activities for your children. There are all kinds of lists that you're probably surrounded by, and it's not very often that we think about that as inspiration for our writing, or even that is writing, but yet it is. There's so many aspects of writing lists that can help us as writers. And a couple of things thinking about fiction that came to mind to me for me were first thinking about description, that we can start with a list of simple items, a chair, a table, but then you can add a little bit more to that to say, a wooden chair, a glass table, and add more to your list to create descriptions. And then that can be added your into your manuscript when it comes to a character, entering a room and noticing what's in the room. Or maybe if you're writing, a crime scene, you have to list things that are seen at a crime scene that are part of the evidence that's collected. There are a multitude of different ways that lists can be incorporated, and they don't have to appear as a list. I think we're all very familiar with a list being, very, vertical, top to bottom, maybe one or two words per line. But really, what came out of this workshop that was so interesting to me was that a lot of the lists involved longer uh, sections of prose, and especially when it came to the description, something of up to like a list of 40 things that a character sees walking into a room. And of course, this was a lot of the references were to more classical literature, so that's also at play here a little bit. But it's definitely something to think about when you get stuck, is think about, well, how can you describe something, and just start making a list of all the different attributes, even if it's of one thing. And that can help to build the language you're using and allow you to create a better visualization opportunity for your reader.
When you say
Um,
like classic
yeah.
literature, it makes me think of the very beginning of Tale of Two Cities and Charles Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was this, it was that. That is essentially a list, and that's like the
Yep.
whole first paragraph, first sentence, I
Ex-
think technically, of the book.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a great example, and that's actually a great example to kind of lead us into the next thing that came to mind, was how it can lend itself to poetry. Because the beginning of that book is, I mean, it's very poetic. It's the best of times. It was it makes you think of poetry, and how that in and of itself, a poem is a list. It's a list of ideas geared towards one particular subject that is, the title of your poem. And an interesting example that he shared about the poet laureate Billy Collins uh, being asked to prepare something to read at one of at the memorial for 9/11 victims, and how at first Billy Collins wasn't sure because he didn't want to just read names, but then he took the names and he turned it into a very beautiful poem about what it meant to have those names. And so that's definitely, the poem is called The Names by Billy Collins, so it's definitely worth looking up as an example of taking what was a list and turning it into a poem that had deeper meaning for more than just a small set of families. Um, and then with that too, going back to the first thing I was talking about with description, is also thinking about character development as
Mhm.
a way to use lists. So you can list character traits, interests, likes, dislikes, career points, behaviors, character names. I'm sure many people have, lists of character names that they go back to pick as they're, writing, coming to a new manuscript. Maybe you have a list of names that you just keep collecting. And so that's the fun thing about lists, is that it can be a way to collect ideas, and you can just jot down quick notes. Maybe you're not in the mood for, long, lengthy prose, but you are in the mood to write something that, especially when it comes to developing your characters, a list is a great way to just quickly jot down in quick succession all of your thoughts about your characters.
I was talking about character names with my boyfriend this other week because we're watching Game of Thrones. He's watched it before, but I'm watching it all for the first time. And the names are so weird. And I told him, oh, I think I know what the writer did. It sounds like he's taken a list, like he's brainstormed a list of like male names. And then he's taken the beginning of this name and combined it with the end of this name. So Stannis is Stanley combined with Dennis, and now he comes up with this brand new name that sounds like it's from this other world. And I don't know, I just kept seeing, like, every time a new character would be introduced, I'd be like, oh, that's this name and this name combined. So I
Uh,
don't know, maybe that is not how he created those names. But you could, if you're trying to create some like really unique names for especially fantasy, or like futuristic sci-fi kind of works. Maybe taking a list of common things and then combining them in a different way, or inverting them in some sort of way, could give you what you're looking for like character names.
well, exactly. And that's such a cool way to think about, if you have a list of common names and how you can manipulate the the names, beginnings with endings, or letters, or mixing up letters, or all different ways that you can then play with the language, which is a fun aspect of using a list, because sometimes you might have things that appear on the list that you don't expect, and it can lead you in a different direction. And one of the great things with using a list is, especially if you're stuck and the blank page is staring at you, is that there's just the psychology of a quick win for yourself with your writing, to say, okay, I got something down on paper today. And I know that I've heard several authors, talk about how they're, writing a quick note on an index card or a post-it, or, and collecting all of those pieces. And those can then create lists for you, and help you bring your ideas together. And also, it's also a way to clear your mind, much like I've talked about in previous podcast episodes about morning pages, which is, of course, stream of consciousness longhand. But a list can certainly serve the same function for that. If you just have thoughts on your in your head and you just need to get it all out on paper. And then it just helps improve your focus, because then you have something you can look at and refer to. And maybe you don't use it right away, but it's something you go, oh, yeah, I made a list of that. Or, oh, yeah, I thought of that scene and I thought of all the things that are in that scene that I want to include. And you can go back to those pieces.
Yeah, something I had read, I believe it was in the book Storyworthy, in reference to extemporaneous writing, is when you get stuck and because you're supposed to keep the pen moving or supposed to keep typing, is when you suddenly finish that one idea and before the next idea unfolds, is to start making a list, whether that's maybe you just typing out numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and then suddenly 4 makes you think of the 4th of July, and then you're on with the next idea. Or colors was another one that it was a really successful one that the book mentioned. um, Types of pets. I mean, just any kind of list, and then that'll
Hmm.
help jog your thoughts, and then you'll go on to the next idea, and then go back later and like just take out those lists. Another interesting thing about lists, and this is would be particularly useful for like things like thrillers or mysteries, crime novels, is using lists to embed your like important detail, right? Because when we read lists, we kind of are like this and this and this. I need bananas and oranges and bread and blah blah and this. And if you embed something important in the list, you are like kind of keeping a secret from the reader that this is something important because you've embedded it in with all this other like seemingly extraneous detail. And then you can pull that out later as being like, oh, it was there all along, but you don't let
Hmm.
them in totally on the like you don't take away the surprise by sneaking it into a list that we as humans are naturally just kind of be like, okay, this is just description, this is just okay, yeah, I walked in the room, saw this, that, and the other. Okay, opened the fridge, this is what they're having for dinner, and like hide the fact or disguise the fact that, oh, but there was chopped almonds on the salad and this person has a nut allergy, but this was buried in this list of all of these other things, and so I didn't really pick up on it then. That's another way that lists actually in the writing can be really helpful and used as a tool.
Yeah, exactly. And another reference in terms of in text is in the workshop, he talked about the novel Life of Pi, which I have not read, but am somewhat familiar with. And in that, there's a long list of supplies for the main character for the expedition on this boat, with the tiger. And so it that plays into setting up, all the things that the character needs. And you might not think it's important, but it does, like you were just saying, embedding something in it does lend itself to the importance of the survival and part of the journey of the main character. So there are definitely so many ways that you can think about embedding and putting lists into your manuscript that could be really fun for things the character notices or things the character does, or any of those ways. And certainly books that have sort of a diary entry feature to them sometimes, like a Bridget Jones diary or something of that nature, might have lists in there that are part of showing character quirks or things that they're hyper focused on, which can be a lot of fun. Uh, and then, of course, I've said a few times that lists can be very helpful with uh, keeping track of your ideas, and also along with that is, as I mentioned just a little bit ago, is that jump starting when you're stuck. And I know, Elizabeth, you mentioned another example from Storyworthy that talks about the benefit of doing that.
Right. Like that's what I was saying with the using the list. Like as you're writing and doing, just start listing anything, types of cars, colors, days of the week, whatever, and that'll your brain will pick up on something in there, and then you can continue on with the next thought as far as like your morning pages or your extemporaneous writing.
Well, yeah, and listener, as you're listening, if you are sitting somewhere right now, you might even be inspired to take out a piece of paper and start, thinking of some of these ideas, types of cars, colors, names, and just, start seeing what comes to mind as you just start, listing them. And I know that a really fun activity that I used to do when I taught middle school language arts, that my students always enjoyed, and I even enjoyed doing it with them, was to start with one word and then your next word has to begin with the last letter of the word you've just written. And so you start to snake the words together. And that can be kind of another fun way to kind of play with building a list if you're feeling like you need a little bit more of a creative. The interesting part was thinking about comments on social media as a form of a list. So, we scroll through social media, you might tap on something, you look at the comments, and the comments form a list. They're all, there's a main idea that comes in whatever the post is, but then everything below that are all the reactions to it, which in and of themselves create a list. And some might be long, some might be short. But that's kind of fun to play around with too, would be, to do some searches of topics that maybe you're wanting to include in your book and see like what are people saying about those topics on social media, and and allow that to then maybe spur inspiration for your dialogue, because then you're getting words that people are actually would actually say, even though they've written them. And so that would be kind of a fun thing to do as well.
Yeah, you posted something recently about like what is your go-to coffee order, and
Mm-hmm.
so then you get a list of like people's go-to coffee orders, and your book is going to take place, at a coffee shop. There's going to be a lot of scenes where you're going to have people ordering their coffee orders. So I think that's great to use something like that, something just from your readership.
Mm-hmm.
You've also mentioned before, I think in an actual episode, I don't think it was in a one-on-one conversation, about Abby Jimenez polling her readers as well, especially those who are nurses, to figure out certain like ailments or all the things that patients have come in to the emergency room with, inserted up their butts, and that is what inspired. Like she used one of those like more extreme examples in one of her recent books. But yeah, that's another great point about how you could use lists. And especially going back to your coffee shop thing, you're going to need a bunch of different diverse orders, and
Mm-hmm.
those are going to come with various indications of people's personalities. Like we can get an image of like an older man drinking like the drip black coffee versus the like younger, millennial or Gen Z, and they've got their oat milk latte with extra this and hold the that and, whatever else. And it lends itself to even speaking to the character a little bit. And then the other point I want to make is a minute ago when you were talking about using lists, to kind of speak to the character and their personality, like when they enter the room, what do they see? I was also thinking about how you could use list to show a character's like either anxiety or OCD
Mm-hmm.
tendencies, or how they, assess a thing like a room for like safety, if they're like say like a PTSD type response for like a former military member, and they walk into a room and they're examining the exits and they're looking at, how many people are there and does anyone look threatening, and you can list those things from the character's perspective to lend to the reader this aspect of their personality and their life and how their past experiences have shaped them.
Oh, exactly. Those are all like amazing examples of ways that you can incorporate lists. And I love that. And the other thing I want to mention too is that we've been focusing a lot on fiction as I've been talking, but really all of this can play so easily into nonfiction writing as well. And of course, particular subject areas lend themselves just naturally to lists, more than others, but through observations and field notes and things of those nature, uh, that can help with your writing of the
Mm-hmm.
lists, more headings and subheadings, which are essentially a list that are guiding me for where I'm going in the writing of the manuscript. And so those are also pieces that, we don't want to forget about how this can play into all the genres and all the different ways. And it might have you, listener, thinking about all the ways that you use lists already that are just sort of part of your habits that you didn't even realize that you were using lists in so many ways, that then you can feed that over into your own writing practice and see where it can take you.
I was just thinking you could show like even some emotional aspect of, say, like I'm going to use a classic example of like a female character, right? And one week she's making her grocery list and it's all the healthy things or whatever. And then maybe she goes through like a breakup and the next week her grocery list has like ice cream on it and potato chips and things to show, how that, change in her relationship circumstance is affecting her, desire for certain foods or anything like that too. So I think there's ways to even use lists to show, someone's emotional state or a change in it at least.
Oh, exactly. I think there's so many ways, like I mentioned earlier, about thinking about just different aspects of someone's personality, or things that they do, daily habits. And you could, not only could it be emotions that are changing, that are influencing, say, a grocery list, but maybe all of a sudden certain habits change, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's a character who takes the same route to work every day, and then all of a sudden that route changes because something happens. And of course, anything with maps can be giving directions is a list.
Mm-hmm.
Recipes. Certainly, if you write cookbooks or if you incorporate recipes into your books in some way, I know some people do that. And so that's certainly a form of, building lists for your readers. And I mean, even as I'm talking about all this, I'm thinking like this could be really fun for me to dive into even more, thinking about using this tool for my own writing.
When I think about it for memoir, one of the ways that I could see people really using it in memoir, because it touches the reader more if you use specific examples, but if you need to show like some diversity in something, or for whatever reason that specific example is not going to like fully present the picture, you could have a list of, say, like all your favorite Christmas presents, but then only go into a story about one of them if that informs your reader about something about you as a person. And another place where I've seen this in sort of a book that's sort of memoir-esque, but it's fiction, is in The Midnight Library, which is a book we're going to be
Mm-hmm.
doing an episode about in a couple of months, where, you get the opportunity to see this woman in these various roles, and you get to be immersed into those new worlds and roles. But then you get to a page later in the book where it lists like, and then she was a this, and then she did this, and then she did this, and then almost like a page or two long in list form of all these other lives that she's lived, because you need to understand as the reader the fact that she's tried way more than the like 5 or 6 that you're going to get more intimate detail on. And so then it goes into a list to kind of show that magnitude without wasting your time as a reader discussing what each of those looked like. It's a short form list of like, and then she was an astronaut, and then she was a this, and then she was a that. So that's another way, both in like memoir and fiction, that you can, you know, portray something without having to go into like really specific detail, but it still maybe speaks to the magnitude of something or the diversity of something, or even just the monotony of a situation too.
Well, and that's such a great example, because that leads into another point that I was going to make, was showing the passing of time. That example from Midnight Library is a great example of that. Of there's this passing of time that we're not experiencing every single other life, but it allows, like you said, it allows the reader to see that, like, okay, we're seeing snapshots of a few, but she really lived so many. And making a list allows for showing that passing of time for things that a character is doing, or it allows for you to say, like, they did this and then this and went here and did
Mhm.
this. And so then it can move the story along. If you choose to use that as a tool, it certainly can be, a list can certainly be an effective way to do that, so that you can include little bits that don't need a whole lot of explanation because you've already seen other, like in Midnight Library, you've seen other lives in such detail, you kind of get the gist of where the author is going with it and the purpose behind it. And so it's not so out of place in the story at that point. You're kind of like, oh, okay, wow, like she did these things, then she did all these other things, and then you finally come to the sort of the culmination of where she's going.
Yeah, that's a great point for like the passage of time. If your memoir, for example, features some stories from like your younger years or when your kids were younger, and then all of a sudden you're jumping into an older period, you could just have a list of like, and then there were the dirty diapers and the tooth fairy, and then there was the school plays, and then there was the soccer team, and then there was the graduation, and just hitting all those just key moments so that the reader sees the passage of time. Maybe you throw in details about like a broken arm that becomes relevant, later on, or whatever you need to put in there to show the passage of time, but also any key elements of moments that are important for during that time period, but don't need to be, dug into with any sort of real detail. Yeah, I think that's a great technique for showing that, and not just jumping timelines, and then all of a sudden the reader has to be like, oh wait, okay, so now the kids are grown, now this is happening, now they've moved to this new place. Using a list could be really helpful for that.
Yeah. So listener, I think as you've heard us talk today, using lists is a great tool for your writing, and we definitely encourage you to get out pen and paper or your laptop or whatever you used for your writing. And hopefully, some of our ideas have sparked you into creating lists about your character or where your book is going. And we hope that you will, if you aren't already subscribed to our newsletter, that in the links in the description, you will jump on our newsletter so that you don't miss more in-depth information that's related to the topics we talk about in the podcast, because we'd love to connect with you there and have you follow along as we continue to share more inspiration for you as writers.